Hey guys, I wanted to make a video for you to hopefully address some of the main issues that I have noticed in your DBQs in the last couple of weeks. Those issues are related to the evidence point, where you are supposed to use 6 documents to support the argument, and then the HIP point as well. And I think the HIP issue is probably self-explanatory. I know a lot of people struggle with that, but with that evidence point, what I've noticed is a lot of people it's not that you're not using 6 documents, but rather you're not using those documents to support the argument. And a lot of times you're kind of losing sight of the argument, losing sight of your thesis that you're supposed to be supporting. So, for instance, with the week 3 DBQ about Peter the Great, it's not just an issue. It's not a question of just like that he got Russians to adopt Western culture, but rather how adopting Western culture was meant to be his step towards making Russia modern and European, right? So I wanted to walk through a modified 5 document DBQ with you guys. Hopefully this will help you see what I'm talking about and help you kind of with the fundamental understanding of what you're being asked to do. And in order to do that, I actually created a whole new DBQ. So this is not one that you will have seen somewhere before. You can't go look up the answers because I literally made it this afternoon. I also wanted it to be a bit of a break from history content studying. So this DBQ is actually based off of the 1950 Disney classic film Cinderella. Now, if you are not familiar with that particular version of Cinderella, that should be fine. As long as you have a basic understanding of the Cinderella fairy tale, you don't have to go watch the movie or anything. But all these documents are available on Canvas for you to go take a look at in the modules. I don't know. I haven't put it together yet. I'm assuming it's going to be modules. Everything's in modules. Go look there, download them, read them, maybe scribble down some notes real fast, and I will wait here for you to do that. So let's start by taking a look at the prompt. And if you read through the prompt, evaluate to what extent fairy godmother had an essential impact on Cinderella's happiness, that is actually essentially a causation essay. Specifically, they're asking to what extent the fairy godmother caused Cinderella's happiness, or, Cinderella's happiness was an effect of the fairy godmother. Essentially, anytime you see the word impact, right, that's causation. That's what that's asking for. So this really is causation. This is about the fairy godmother and her role in Cinderella's happiness. And anytime we're asked an evaluative prompt like that, evaluate to what extent, that's an evaluative prompt, our answer should be on some kind of spectrum, right? Again, if we're thinking about this in terms of a causation essay, to what extent did the fairy godmother cause Cinderella's happiness, the spectrum is going to be either she was not at all a cause, she was one of many causes, she was most of the causes, or she was completely and totally the cause of Cinderella's happiness. So you see that kind of spectrum there. That's why they give you essay prompts like this, is so that you have the opportunity to show the complexity of the situation by answering on a spectrum rather than just yes or no. All right, so in document 1, we see the fairy godmother creating a coach and horses out of a pumpkin and a handful of mice. And so this document is here to show us why context is important, right? The situation is important because, okay, she makes a coach and horses out of a pumpkin and mice. Cool. How is that essential to Cinderella's happiness, right? Well, we know that Cinderella needs a ride to get to the ball where she can dance and be happy and also meet the prince, which is not her goal at the moment. Regardless, she does not have a ride to that ball because her stepmother and stepsisters left already. So in order to be happy at the ball, she needs the fairy godmother's ride. Not only that, but this isn't like, you can't just call, to sound like I'm pandering to the young kids, you can't just call an Uber, right? Like, you couldn't just call somebody up to rent a coach for the evening. She needs this magic, right? The magic's the only way she's getting a ride at this point. So she might not have needed the fairy godmother if it weren't for the situation before the fairy godmother arrived, the situation that, she'd been left behind by her step family. So having that contextual information becomes important for us to make the argument that the fairy godmother was essential to Cinderella's happiness. All right, so now we've moved on to document 2, and document 2 is meant to be an example of documents that can be a little bit tricky and can possibly be argued or used in multiple ways. So on the surface of document 2, this is a conversation between Cinderella and her fairy godmother in the garden when the fairy godmother first shows up. Cinderella's crying and she's upset, and the fairy godmother is speaking with her. So on the surface, it looks like this is a document that's supposed to show us that the fairy godmother has shown up to help Cinderella get to the ball. She says, "You can't go to the ball looking like that. Here I am. Let's pick ourselves up and let's go," right? She's making Cinderella feel better by saying, "We're going to go to the ball." But if you really look at what is being said here about the situation, note where the fairy godmother says that if you had lost all your faith, I couldn't be here. Not even like I wouldn't be here, I could not be here. So while we can acknowledge that the fairy godmother did the magic, right, in this particular document, it's telling us that the fairy godmother wouldn't have even been present in the first place if it weren't for Cinderella not having lost her faith. So that's really about something inside Cinderella that allowed the fairy godmother to come. So by using that information in document 2, pretty much anything that the fairy godmother does after that is thanks to the fact that Cinderella didn't lose faith. So her happiness essentially comes down to her. So it's a little tricky, right? And so I wanted to put one of those in there for you guys because you see those sometimes, the ones that can kind of swing to either side of the argument depending on how you use it. All right, so document 3 is a picture because sometimes we have pictures in DBQs, right? This picture shows us Cinderella in her magical new dress from her fairy godmother. You see all the magic sparkles all around it. And that's great, right? Everybody loves a new outfit. But remember, we're trying to argue about the essential nature of the fairy godmother. So does Cinderella getting a new dress really mean that the godmother was essential? Is the dress essential to her happiness? Well, she needs the dress to go to the ball. Did she have a dress before this? No. Let's think about the situation, right? The historical situation, the context. So if you remember from earlier in the movie, just before all of this, Cinderella did actually already have a dress. She had that pink and white dress that was made by her mouse friends. And she could have gone to the ball in that, but what happened? Right, her stepsisters tore it to shreds. So she did not have anything to go to the ball in until the fairy godmother showed up. They would not have allowed her into the ball wearing shreds or rags or whatever. So in this instance, the new dress was essential for her to be able to enter the ball, have fun, meet the prince, whatever. So knowing the context, knowing the situation of what happened leading up to the giving of this dress or what necessitated the giving of this dress is context that helps us argue the importance of the fairy godmother's help. Okay, document 4 is another tricky one for you guys. So in document 4, we get the standard warning, the whole spell is going to wear off at the stroke of midnight. And at first glance, again, that's not helpful, right? You're telling me that this help is limited, right? And so that doesn't seem very helpful. But then Cinderella says that it's more than she ever hoped for. So why would she say something like that? And how can we turn that to our advantage? Well, now we need to think about Cinderella's personal background that would explain why she would say that and her experiences. And so that little help, the little help that she is getting all the way until midnight, is a big deal to Cinderella because she has not had anyone be kind to her in a very long time, right? She's lived with her stepmother who hates her and actively works against her and uses her as a servant, and her stepsisters are jealous, etc. Both her parents are dead. It kind of depends. I don't remember what this version of the movie says, but one or both of her parents are dead. So this little bit of kindness all the way up until at least midnight, right? It's more than Cinderella could have ever hoped for. So even though it will go away at midnight, it is still very important to her. So knowing that background information, knowing about where Cinderella is coming from, her point of view and her experiences, explain why she says it's more than I ever hoped for, and helps us show that in having her say that, the fairy godmother is actually very essential to her happiness. All right, last document, document 5. So this scene is from the very end of the movie when everyone is trying on the glass slipper and Cinderella's stepmother trips the footman so that the slipper breaks before Cinderella can try it on. Now, it is Cinderella who saved the other glass slipper that then allows her to prove that she was the one at the ball. That's what we see here, right? It breaks and the Duke is like, this is terrible. What's going to happen? And nothing can help. And she said, but I have the other slipper. So that's on Cinderella. She's the one who kept the slipper. Now, it could be argued, possibly, that the glass slippers were from the fairy godmother to begin with. However, also, it was the fairy godmother's stupid midnight rule is the reason why Cinderella had to run away before actually sharing her identity with the prince to begin with. Now, in my personal opinion, sharing your identity is probably one of the first things you should do, but we're going to leave that behind. In any case, this is something where Cinderella was smart enough to keep this other piece of proof that she was at the ball. You can say this is a matter of brain. You can say this is a matter of her heart and sentimentality, whatever you like. But this was Cinderella, right? She saved her own day on this one. So hopefully we're starting to kind of see a connection between documents 5 and document 2. A bit of this common thread that in a certain sense, Cinderella was actually responsible for her own happiness to some degree. So let's see if we can find some other groupings here. So now that we've been through all the documents, it's time to go on to document grouping, which is an essential part of this process, because grouping the documents is, first of all, going to help us generate a thesis statement and also just make a more organized essay that is easier to read and easier to understand and therefore easier to grade. So because this is a 5-document essay, this is a modified DBQ, I am only going to focus on having 2 main groups of documents. If this were a 7-document DBQ, then you would want to try for 3 groups. But like I said, modified, so 2 will be fine. So normally what I tell you guys with the DBQ when we're getting started on our response, our thesis, a good tip is just to start with what you know. Start with your instinct, because even if you can't recall specific details, there is something in you, you're an educated young adult, you should have a general idea of the answer of the response. And so based on the documents that we've looked at, based on what we know from the Cinderella story already, our response to this is probably going to say that the fairy godmother was at least to some degree essential in Cinderella's happiness. And so if we start off with that idea, right, the fairy godmother was essential, okay, well, that's great. That responds to the prompt, but it doesn't have those basically lines of defense like our categories. So again, we're only really working with 2 groups. And so if we just kind of look at all of the evidence that we got that says that the fairy godmother was essential, we said maybe like in document 1, document 3, document 4, right? All of those showed us that the fairy godmother was essential in some way. And if we think about them, okay, carriage, we had the dress, and we had time at the ball. So we can't just say that she was essential. We have to actually give a line of defense there. So she was essential because she got Cinderella to the ball. She gave her something to wear there. She gave her time to be there. It all seems to center around her ability to go to and be at the ball. Okay, so the fairy godmother was essential to Cinderella's happiness because she gave Cinderella the means to enjoy the ball where she met her prince. So now we need to figure out what to do with those last couple of documents. Those were documents 2 and 5. And we kind of already mentioned that there was a similar thread between those documents. And that thread was that actually Cinderella was responsible for her own happiness. So if we're taking that in terms of a response to the prompt, that response would start off with the fairy godmother was not essential to Cinderella's happiness. And that's not enough for an argument there, right? Even if we are doing something like a concession or a counter argument to go against whatever the original statement was, you still have to have the best reason why it's wrong. Like you still have to have a reason. You can't just say, some might say she was not essential, but actually she was. Like that's not going to do it. So we just need another category, right? So documents 2 and 5 say that the fairy godmother was not essential to Cinderella's happiness because Cinderella had the means to create happiness for herself. Okay. So I know what some of you are probably thinking, right? But Miss T, that's an X statement. Miss T, that's a counter argument. Yes, I understand. Yes, it is. It still counts. It still counts as a second grouping, right? Remember, this is about complexity. And so it is okay for your groups in your thesis statement to be contradictory. You don't necessarily have to have two groups plus a counter argument, or 3 groups plus a counter argument. Your counter argument can actually be one of the main body paragraphs, but you have to treat it like a main body paragraph if you're going to do that, right? It can't just be thrown in at the end. In order to really make sure that you're showing off your understanding of a complex situation, you have to give it its full due, okay? So now we have to kind of put these together, and this is kind of the difficult part. We have to put these together to make a thesis statement that, again, shows that complexity. And so if you remember, we have a thesis statement formula for this. It's X, however, ABC, whatever. Therefore, Y statement, okay? The X is that counter argument. However, then we have our lines of defense. Therefore, response to the prompt. So this is how I would assemble this given what we have here, okay? So Cinderella had the means to create happiness for herself. However, the fairy godmother was the one to give Cinderella the means to enjoy her time at the ball where she met Prince Charming, and we're going to capitalize it because that's actually his name. Therefore, the fairy godmother was essential to Cinderella's happiness. So I didn't want to have to subject you guys to actually having to watch me write this essay, and I would really like to think that you got the point. But I did want to take a run at doing an intro paragraph, because that's another thing that we kind of struggle with is the context. And so I wanted to try to do that intro there. Now, the problem with this is that Cinderella is a fairy tale and it's not anchored in real life and therefore really doesn't have historical context. However, like many Disney movies, the animators do actually draw from historical and cultural references, like real references. And so by looking at the animation and the movie, you can actually kind of get a little bit of an idea of what time and place they are using as influence in their animations and their character design. And this is going to sound kind of ridiculous, but stick with me. By looking at the clothing of the characters in the 1950 Cinderella movie, specifically the pants that the guys are wearing and her stepmother's sleeves, best of my knowledge, they are somewhere in Europe in the 19th century. And so if I'm, just going to use that as my jumping off point for writing some historical context. Now, remember, historical context is about connecting our topic to wider historical events. And so we've come up with a time period to draw historical events from. So we have to connect back to that. The way I did it with this, though, is I actually worked backwards from the prompt to get to that wider historical process, just because it's a little difficult with this. So I worked backwards. So the whole idea here is Cinderella's happiness. Well, why does she not have happiness, right? She can't go to the ball. Her stepmother's mean to her. Okay, so we have a couple of options. You can talk about some kind of context about having balls and royalty and monarchy in the 1850s. I tried that one. It was a little tough. So I went the other direction. Stepmother, right? Her stepmother is making her unhappy. Well, why does she have a stepmother? What's the deal with that? Well, depending on which version of Cinderella you are watching or reading or what have you, one or both of her parents are dead, right? And if this is the mid-19th century, what possibly could have killed her, in this instance, mother, right? Because she gets a stepmother. So again, in most versions of this story, it looks to be some sort of illness, definitely not an industrial accident, at least. So we can kind of go off of that. Well, what are some illnesses from the mid 1800s and what would have caused some of those illnesses, right? Those are wider historical processes. Those are things that are happening all over the world. So that's what I used, and that's where I started. So all the way up to the top there. Thanks to growing urbanization in the 19th century, it was not uncommon for diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid to create many widows and widowers in cities and villages across Europe. So nice and broad, okay? But we got to start getting it down to the topic. We got to start turning it to make it more relevant to Cinderella. Well, these diseases made second marriages and stepfamily common as well. These second marriages were often done out of necessity rather than genuine care, which is the situation Cinderella found herself in as a child. Lady Tremaine, because that's her stepmother's name, did not bond with her stepdaughter and actively worked to deny Cinderella any happiness, including things as simple as allowing her to attend the prince's royal ball. So now we're right on the doorstep of the topic of the essay, which is Cinderella's happiness, right? And so we're going to make our claim, make our stance about who was responsible for that happiness. So, although Cinderella used the means she had to create happiness for herself, her fairy godmother was the one who gave her the means to enjoy her time at the ball where she met Prince Charming. Therefore, the fairy godmother was essential to Cinderella's eventual happiness. You can see I color-coded that thesis statement there. But we started big, started wide, and then just made it relevant to Cinderella and specifically her happiness down in the thesis statement. And that's where we would go get into the body paragraphs. All right, I hope that was somewhat helpful. Like I said, I'm not going to write the whole DBQ unless someone feels the need to see it, unless you really need to see it. But otherwise, I feel like hopefully this should have given you the idea of looking for those hip instances, how to work them into your argument, and also just keeping your actual thesis statement, whatever the actual argument is, at the front of your mind the whole time. But I'm not going to stick around here. You guys know where to find me if you need help on any other DBQ stuff. I have to go stop a cat from eating some headphones, and I hope to hear from you guys soon. See you around.